just getting the camera going, I wanted to just take 1 minute to express my thanks to a very respected journalist that we lost over the weekend, Chuck Johnson. Chuck was at my book launch party for my horse racing book in 2019. It was very gracious of him to come and support a young writer, not so young, but you know, new writer, let's say that. And at that event, Chuck asked me, what surprised you the most about your research into Montana horse racing? And I said, Marcus Daly. I said, there's enough material on him to write a book. And Chuck kind of looked at me and he said, you know, he says, I don't think anybody has done anything on Daly in a long time. And so the genesis of the book today was in large part thanks to Chuck Johnson. So if I had a moment, which I don't because I've got 50 slides in 50 minutes, but I'd like everybody to just say that Chuck was an amazing human being and we're going to miss him a great deal. So with that, are we live, Kim?
Oh, yes.
Okay. So, Marcus Daly. Okay. Nope.
It's the one right in front of the, there you go.
Push the wrong button. Yeah. Yale Farrell, who was a newspaperman, described Marcus Daly as Prince of the American Turf and Mining King of the World. We all know there's a large statue of him up at the entrance to Tech. This is the statue in its original location, which was on Main, where cars would slide into it in the wintertime and a few other things once we switched over from horses to automobiles, and they eventually moved it. The other reason they moved it is a lot of people didn't like its location. Many of you who live here have heard of a character named Matty Kiley, and he said rather famously, Marcus Daly never turned his arse on the mines of Butte or the miners of Doug. And so they didn't like that location because he was facing away from the head frames. And so now he's somewhere else. This was when they unveiled the statue in 1907 on Labor Day. And Marcus Daly was already a myth by then. He was a heroic figure. I don't need to repeat the history of Butte, Montana after Marcus Daly's death through the World War I period. But people needed a hero, and they wanted somebody who had cared about them and looked after them and thought about them as well as his own profits. And so he got a statue. One of the things about Daly is that he'd asked his widow, his wife, Margaret, that when he died, burn everything. And they have stories that train car loads of boxes came from Butte and Anaconda over to Hamilton to the stock farm, where she tasked one of her ranch hands with shoveling them into a stove. And so we do not have the kind of primary source material on Marcus Daly that we have, for example, W.A. Clark, who, if you didn't know what Clark thought or what he was doing, you just weren't paying any attention because he tended to make himself visible. There's been a few books written about Daly. Most of them, either Daly as the hero or Daly as the villain, and no documentation in either case. So, when I started this project, I had a challenge on my hands to figure out who was this man and where did he come from. And I'm going to torment you for only 1 minute with a little story of where he came from.
The Garden of Eden has vanished, they say, but I know the lie of it still. Just turn to the left at the bridge of Twain and stop when halfway to Butte Hill. 'Tis there you will find it, I know sure enough, that fortune has come to my call.
So basically, Daly came from a place about as different from Butte, Montana, as you can imagine. He came from a very lush area, a rich farming area. He was Irish Catholic, as Irish can be. There was a friend of his here in Butte named Hugh Daly. Some people call him Cousin Hugh. Whether he was a direct relative, I cannot find any evidence to trace how close of a Cousin Hugh was, so it could be a bit. But he did research into Clan O'Daly and later became a member of the Robert Emmet Literary Society or Association, which we all know is a fairly radical, militant, pro-Irish organization here in Butte. And he decided, and actually his research was a little bit gilded, but he was not entirely wrong. There were some genealogists in Ireland who also said the Clan O'Daly originated in Westmeath, and during the time that Oliver Cromwell was busily destroying Ireland, most of the clan, they had a history of having been chieftains and leaders in that area. They left and they went into other locations, including County Cavan. And I also want to do a quick shout out here to Father Beretta, who is in the audience today. Please correct my Irish if I get it wrong. I'm going to say, how do I say that? So I am unfortunately not of Irish heritage. I'm Scandinavian German from the Golden Triangle up north. So that's of course why I have to write about an Irishman. Outsiders, we have that perspective that sometimes we see things that might be missed when you're too close to it, I guess. At least that's my story and I'm sticking to it. So where did he live? He lived near a little townland called Daly, and there's a great question of how poor were the Dalys. Now, during the famine, everybody wasn't doing very well, so that's obvious. But he probably came from a family that was, Hugh Daly said they were comfortable. And although Hugh liked to gild everything, he also was a person who wanted to say everything about being Irish is good and everything about being British is bad. And so he had no reason to gild Daly's own family. He was motivated to say, here's how we were all poor and oppressed. So when Hugh says they were comfortable farmers, he probably was on the right track. Later writers said that Daly was a fugitive from a poverty-haunted farm, and during the famine that may very well be true. It's important to know that anybody writing about Daly was kind of expressing their own motives as much as the facts. And so some people said, oh, he was homeschooled by his mother. Well, that's what they did in the Western frontier. Daly probably went to either a hedge school or possibly, there were a few Catholic schools by the mid-1840s. There were some national schools back then. Daly probably had a primary school education. Some people thought he was illiterate. He wasn't illiterate. He clearly could read and write. We have letters right here in the archives that were written in his own hand. We have his testimony before the United States Senate in 1900 when they were debating whether they would seat W.A. Clark in the U.S. Senate, and they took down his testimony verbatim. You pick up his grammar, you pick up his syntax. It wasn't quite Queen Victoria's way of speaking, but he loved words, and when you see his interviews, he played with words. He had this gift of sarcasm you did not ever want to be on the receiving end from. There was a room at the Hotel Montana over in Anaconda that they called the sweatbox because it was his office. And if he called you into the sweatbox, you would come out drenched because you would be burned. They said his sarcasm could peel the bark from a tree. So this was a very articulate, very intelligent individual. This picture of County Cavan right here, Daly Bridge, or actually it's called Mont Nugent Bridge now, but historically it was near a town called Daly's Bridge. And how connected that is to our Marcus Daly, it's hard to say, but certainly that clan name was known. This little building is in County Cavan and is believed to be the last standing outbuilding on Luke Daly's allotment, on the ground land he tenanted. Luke was Marcus Daly's father. If you'll notice, there's a little marker right here. And folks in County Cavan put a memorial up to him. Now, you'll hear some early accounts that will say that this little outbuilding, whoops, jumping ahead, that this little outbuilding was the family hovel where 11 children were raised. I doubt it. There's evidence that certainly by 1856, when there was a nationwide land valuation made, there were more than one Luke Daly. Again, everyone who is Irish, you know there must not have been very many names because they recycled them all the time. And so we had Luke Daly, whose son was Luke Daly, whose father might have been Luke Daly, but there were at least 2 Luke Dalys in Griffiths for this area. One had about 21 acres, one had 40, which for Ireland was a lot. That was a fairly significant land allotment. Plus, we have local historians who say that they had a nice farmhouse, it was good size, and so on. In Ulster during the famine, there were fewer land evictions than in some other parts of the country. There was some historic unwritten protections for tenants that as long as they could pay their rent, they could stay on their land. The Dalys probably sent out the children to work. There's evidence Daly did that, and so they survived. We don't have much documentation at all, and even in County Cavan, there's not much documentation. Again, Father Beretta was kind enough to put me in touch with a number of people in Ireland, and I tormented them to almost despair with any number of questions, but they went to a great deal of work, and I would also like to thank those folks. They're in the acknowledgments of my book. They're wonderful human beings. If Luke Daly's family had a large farmhouse, it may have been a gathering point for the neighborhood where people would meet and talk about everything from politics to local gossip, play music, and so on. Hugh Daly claimed they had more than a local reputation as horse breeders and horse trainers. That does not necessarily mean they owned their animals, although if they did, they would have looked like this fellow who is a workhorse. He also claims that they had been part of the Young Ireland movement, and that the Young Ireland movement was a group of people who sought freedom for Ireland. One of their leaders was somebody we know here in Montana very well, Mr. Thomas Francis Marr, who was famous in Ireland for being the man who introduced the Irish tricolour to the world in 1848. And we also know he had a far more interesting story after that and winds up in a large statue in Helena. The best part of the Marr statue is that the project to have that statue commissioned was begun about 1898, and the president of the Thomas Francis Marr Memorial Association was, I'm going to give you take a wild guess, Marcus Daly. And although he died before they finished the statue, we also know about the famous Clark-Daly feud and the Capitol fight in 1894, one of Clark's few victories where Helena became the state capital. And I always think that it's quite fitting that Marcus Daly saw to it that Mr. Marr's statue is very prominently displayed on the front lawn. So the territory is marked, and the flag of Ireland flies in front of the Montana Capitol on St. Patrick's Day. This is just a quick picture of St. Mary's Church in Crosserley Parish in County Cavan. Marcus Daly donated the money to have this statue put in. How do I say that?
Crosserlock.
Okay, that is
what do you mean,
yes,
the
yes.
statue?
So I don't say Crosserley, how do you say Crosserlock?
Crosserlock.
Thank you very much. And then what do you call the statue?
Stabat Mater.
Okay, and so this is an image of Jesus with the women at the foot of the cross. You cannot see the little dedication plaque even with it blown up, but I love how it says that Marcus Daly was from Gold Mines, Montana, America. And so, yeah, that's kind of like Butte, America. And we are to pray for the souls of his deceased parents. And he donated this. It was put up in 1894. His family tree is extremely complicated, but as you can see, there were 11 children living. Some of these birth dates are estimates or guesses. I actually had to sit down with the calendar and do the math to see First three children are kind of spaced apart, but then after Marcus Daly was born, the dam kind of broke there for a while, 1842, 1843, 1844, and I'm like, is this even physically possible biologically? I think it is. We have a mystery with Patrick Daly, I'll get to in a moment. But this family tree, it's also in my book, and it took a lot of work to sleuth this whole thing out. The most interesting person in the bunch was Anna O'Farrell, Daly's oldest sister, who came to America. According to her obituary, it was 1851, but I did find an Anne Daly in New Haven, Connecticut in 1850 in the census, so I found very quickly the Dalys and the Evans family, Margaret Evans Daly's family, had an extremely casual relationship with dates. I have headstones that say somebody was born in a certain year, and then I find the census data from 2 years prior to that where the person was a baby. So we know, especially the women, but even the men, they kept fudging their ages quite a bit. That's a thing. But she married John O'Farrell in Connecticut. They came to California, and we find the O'Farrell family in Auburn, California in the 1860 US Census. In that census document, and how many people do genealogy and census research in here? Those of you who do know that even the census is sometimes not correct. But they have their oldest son being born in California in 1858. So that's why I'm guessing that was when they went to California. That oldest son, I found a small death notice for a Charles O'Farrell dying in 1872. There can always be multiple people with the same name, but the weight of the evidence, as I like to say, suggests they lost him fairly young. The O'Farrells came to Butte sometime after 1880, although their son John Jr. was probably there by 1880 because he does pop up in some records in Butte. He was one of Daly's first workers at the Anaconda. She is buried in Butte. You can find this monument out at the cemetery. Anna and John were the proxies for Marcus Daly when he purchased the Anthony Chapin homestead in the Bitte Valley in 1886, and that became the Bitte Stock Farm. She had 3 of her children die before she did, one of whom was John O'Farrell Jr., who Daly just absolutely, truly loved, said it was a true friend, probably viewed the young man almost as his son. Quite devastated by his death. I think it was typhoid. Anna herself died of what they called Bright's disease, which was the same thing they attributed Marcus Daly's death to. That's a description of symptoms including kidney failure and heart disease. One of the diseases we know that it describes is untreated type 2 diabetes. That's the most likely cause of death, but all we know is that the official diagnosis was Bright's disease. John O'Farrell Sr. went back to California for a while, died in Sacramento, but they brought his remains, and he too is buried in Butte. Most interesting of Daly's brothers was Patrick. Some people call him Patrick J. Daly. He became a state legislator, served in the Montana Senate, died in 1909 of a heart attack, made the news all over the state. He too is buried here in Butte. The interesting mystery about him is that his headstone says he was born in 1856, but there, say it again. Crusherlock, okay. I'm still going to screw that up forever, but you're just going to have to come with me every time I talk, so that's what's going to happen. The baptism records say he was born in 1845. We have a Patrick Daly, born on St. Patrick's Day, baptized a few days later in March of 1845, child of Luke and Mary Coyle Daly. So was this the same Patrick Daly, or did they have a younger child or an older child who died, and then when he was born later, they recycled the name? I don't know, but he's an interesting individual. One of the other siblings that came to Montana was Kate Rudden, and she too is buried in Butte. She was married to a Patrick Rudden. He was mentioned in the newspaper. She and Patrick were both at the 1907 statue unveiling, but he apparently died thereafter. She was very close to her brother, also named Patrick, just follow me here. She died in Anaconda, and she was so ticked off at the relatives in Ireland that she left everybody only $1, except for Molly Gerard, who was Daly's second oldest daughter, who had been helpful to her, and she left her maybe $1,000, not very much money, and gave everything else to the church, to the local parish priest, who had, by the way, helped her rewrite her will and signed and witnessed it with her. And so there was a delightful probate in Anaconda where they had a will contest that the courts upheld, but thanks to that probate, we have a very good picture of the Daly family tree.
We don't do that anymore.
So, on the East Coast, we found 3 more of Daly's siblings. The most interesting one took me the longest to find, which was Thomas, and there's still a possibility this Thomas brother or cousin, it's still a little fuzzy, but the New York Times mentioned his own son, who was named his son Marcus Daly, so is this fine fellow, died in the late 60s. And in one article they said that Thomas was a cousin of Marcus Daly, but in the Marcus Daly obituary they said that Thomas was our Marcus Daly's brother, so I'm going to go with that. Even the New York Times has obituaries with mistakes in them, but again, weight of the evidence, I think we had a brother here, and they definitely banked on this family connection in their lifetime. This guy is an interesting character. I will tell you, you'll have to learn more about him later. There is a Thomas Daly that pops up in Butte. I don't know if it's the same person, and what's super weird is the 1880 census mentions that the head of the household of Margaret with daughters Maggie and Molly and so on was Thomas Daly, but its job as mill superintendent, so it was obviously Marcus. But I'm kind of wondering if maybe Brother Thomas was living in Butte for a while and he was living at the house and the census taker just couldn't wrap their brain around 2 adult men in the same house and screwed it up. I don't know. But anyway, that's Thomas. Mary Daly, we don't know much about her other than Kate Rudden gave her $1. And Owen Daly didn't even get the $1. He lived in Connecticut, which makes sense because that's where the O'Farrells also settled. But his descendants have found pretty solid evidence that he too was one of Daly's brothers, and they've come out to Montana, they've done a ton of genealogical research, and the descendants of Owen Daly have been quite helpful to me as well. So, there were 4 siblings that stayed behind in Ireland, 3 boys, James, Luke the son, and in the baptism and cemetery records of the parish we have Peter, who died fairly young. And then there's Honor. She's probably the most interesting person in this entire extended family. Apparently never married, no children. She pops up in the census, we know she exists. There is a photograph that I have seen, and now I can't remember where I found it, if it was here at the archives or at the Historical Society, but she had a very nice farmhouse that she was said to have built with remittances sent to her by Marcus Daly. In 1921, that house was destroyed by the Black and Tan. It's a pro-British paramilitary group, and apparently this was a consequence of her having supported and given shelter to members of the Irish Republican Army. So Honor was the radical for sure. Daly comes to America in 1856. This is just a picture of Manhattan Island. This round building here was called Castle Garden. That was the immigrant processing center prior to Ellis Island, where he would have gone through. Almost all accounts of Daly's life say he came to America in 1856 at age 15. Now that's perhaps sloppy math. I've got a December birthday, so does Daly. I'm here to tell you, he probably was 14 when he got on the ship and came to America, because you didn't have a lot of ship traffic in December. Most of the ships carrying immigrants came over April, May, June. There was some traffic year-round, but the bulk of people were coming in better weather. And at 14, he would have been considered a man. He could do a man's work. He had many odd jobs. Different accounts list different jobs, and I am guessing that when you look at the adult Marcus Daly, who had sarcasm, you can well imagine that at 14 he probably had a very smart mouth. I suspect that he immediately charmed his way into any job he wanted, and probably in a fairly short period of time snarked his way out of the same job. So all of these various jobs, I suspect he did all of them. His sister was already here in the States. By 1856, she and her husband John may or may not have already left for California. There are some records that say Daly lived for a time with a sister. So he probably did stay with her at first before they moved on to California. In New York, he arrived as the Tammany Hall political machine was rising, and it's pretty clear it had an influence. His favorite racehorse was named Tammany. They called the stallion barn Tammany Hall Stables. This was a 1900 calendar in Hamilton. A very, very powerful support network for immigrant Irish. He would have landed at the top of a time period when signs literally said no Irish need apply. We hit the door, I bet. And I will talk over that a little bit louder, hopefully we'll be good. The Know-Nothings were a political movement in America, the American National Party. They were anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-anybody who was not quite Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And yes, indeed, there were signs that said no Irish need apply. You can go through want ads for employments. They would say Protestant only, and so on and so forth. So that was really, Tammany Hall was one bulwark for Irish Catholics against that. At play, I love these old carts. Look at those wheels and these guys up there. If you wonder why they used to talk about a bobtailed bay, they cut those tails short, and if you think about those spinning spokes, no wonder why. They also, when there was snow, they would have the sleighs going through the streets of New York, and if anybody's ever heard Jingle Bells, listen to the second and third and fourth verses. These guys, this was cruising Maine, guys. The young men would get the girls, sit next to them in the little cutters, they'd get all snuggly, and then they'd go rocketing down the streets. A day or two ago, I thought I'd take a ride as soon as Fanny Bryce was seated by my side. Nowadays, kids cruise Maine, same thing. Tramps like us, baby, we are born to run. We've always had songs like that. Most of all, Daly and Marr were in New York at the same time. I don't think they met, I have no evidence of it, and Marr was much older than Daly. He was rich, he was famous. Daly was a poor newsboy, but Marr launched a paper called the Irish News in 1856. If Daly was a newsboy, he might have sold it. A few other big things that happened while Daly was in New York: the Dead Rabbits Riot in 5 Points of New York. And then, of course, what's interesting is the correspondence between the outbreak of the Civil War and Daly deciding he was going to leave for California. I don't think that's a coincidence. As he goes west, in my book I've got a expanded version of this map kind of showing you the various places he was. And then he did not take the Oregon Trail. He came by ship. He came through the Isthmus of Panama, probably working for his fare. In California, we've got some examples. This is at Arastra, where they would put the ore into this little patio area, hitch a mule or a horse to the arm, and go round and round and round dragging rocks. And I want to also do a shout out in here. Yes, David's here. Raise your hand. Larry, raise your hand. I'm embarrassing these guys publicly because I could not have done any of this mining material without their help. And everything that's wrong, they had nothing to do with. That's all on me, okay? Just letting you know, I didn't take always everybody's advice. The places that Daly went, he was all over California for at least a couple years. And the most interesting thing, though, this totally has nothing to do with Daly, but it was a coincidence. It was just too much fun not to put in the book. The O'Farrells, remember, were in Auburn, California. And I found a number of things where John O'Farrell was an election judge. He was this, he was that. There were birth announcements. They were there well through the 1860s. So was Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, also known in history as Pomp, the little baby, Sacagawea's son from the Lewis and Clark expedition. He ran the Orleans Hotel, which I believe is this building in the center with the balcony, and he was the proprietor. So certainly anybody traveling through Auburn probably stopped at the Orleans for a drink. Charbonneau was well known in the community. His obituary was run in the Auburn newspaper. He had decided in 1866 to go back to Montana, and unfortunately got sick and died before he got here. But I sometimes do wonder, did Marcus Daly first hear of Montana from a member of the Lewis and Clark expedition, the youngest member? The other people in California, well before Daly, we all know from the Anaconda Copper Company. George Hearst, James Ben-Ali Hagan, and Lloyd Tevis. By the way, Hagan and Tevis were brothers-in-law, so they were pretty tight. Opposite personalities. Hagan is the most important one, and we're going to talk about him a little bit. Yes, this is Mount Hagan. It is named for this man. This was you don't see this picture of him very often as a younger man, but he was of Turkish ancestry, and the press sometimes called him the Turk, the Sultan. They didn't really like that he was very savvy in business. He was kind of a quiet man who played his cards carefully, and then when he struck, he was like Daly, he'd strike without warning, and he usually won. He also was a horseman. He had Rancho del Paso, 44,000 acres in California, the largest horse ranch in the world. He was truly Daly's lifelong friend, and although Daly sometimes claims that Hagan had something to do with the Clark-Daly feud, it was already underway in 1889 when Clark did what Clark sometimes did a lot of, which is to say very candid things when he shouldn't. And Mr. Hagan was late for a meeting, and Mr. Clark declared he was not going to wait around for that. Fill in the blank of a racial slur that begins with N. And that obviously went over quite poorly with Mr. Hagan. So he certainly was on the same wavelength as Marcus Daly when it came to dealing with our good friend W.A. Clark. Daly goes to Nevada sometime between 1863 and 1865. It's a little fuzzy. There was actually a lot of commerce back and forth over the passes between California and Nevada. So it's possible that he went to Nevada, worked for a while, came back to Grass Valley, Nevada City, worked for a while, kind of went back and forth a little bit. His first boss was supposedly Bill Skyrum, who is this gentleman here, winds up coming to Butte, and I believe we've had a story in the paper about Bill. Daly called him Scarum. I'm assuming that Skyrum was I think Welsh was where he was from, and they obviously were playing with the name. Skyrum was one of the managers at the High Ore when Daly was wealthy and touring the mine with a bunch of investors, and he orders Daly to put out his cigar. So Skyrum never was intimidated by Daly in the least. We have Daly on a dance committee in Virginia City in 1865, so it's the first time his name pops up in a newspaper. In 1870, he pops up in the census in a mining region in central Nevada called White Pine. There's a city called Hamilton, Nevada, now a ghost town. The closest modern town to this area was Ely. And then about 50 miles to the west was a place called Mineral Hill, where Jeremiah Kelly was running operations. His son was Con Kelly. And some people say that Daly worked at Mineral Hill, but the source on that was the Isaac Marcusson book about Anaconda. Con Kelly was Marcusson's primary source on a lot of that, and Con Kelly had not been born at the time Jeremiah Kelly was in Mineral Hill, so our best evidence is that Daly was mostly in White Pine, but all of these guys were on the Comstock. Every last one of them. So even though they scattered to the winds, they all came back around. The most important individual in the Daly's Nevada years was John Mackey. He was one of the Bonanza Kings when they hit the big one in 1873, which was after Daly left. But Mackey hired Daly, may have given him some of his first management jobs as a shift boss, and was one of the pallbearer along with James Van Alley Hagen at Daly's funeral. Not only that, but Daly was buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York, and they did not have a spot for him there yet, and so the Mackey permitted the family mausoleum to be used as a resting place for Daly. And I'm not sure if the place for Daly is not, that's part of that whole structure, if they built a separate one, but Mackey was obviously very close to Daly. And if anybody wonders what Virginia City, Nevada looked like, there it is. The other question is, how well did Marcus Daly know Mark Twain? I tried to track the timeline down. Twain does not mention Marcus Daly in his autobiography, but Twain was in Nevada in 1863 as a journalist writing for the Territorial Enterprise. He tended to mix fact with fiction to a level that today would be libelous, and so he had to split town. He went to stay with some friends in Calaveras County, California in the winter of 1864-65. You can't make this stuff up. The cabin where he lived with his friends was a location called Jackass Hill. You can't make this stuff up. And there he wrote a short story and realized that his actual gift was not journalism, it was fiction, and he becomes famous. Now, this means that he goes on a speaking tour and he comes back to Nevada in 1866. There were a few people in Nevada that were still maybe a little miffed at Twain, and they felt he had to be taken down a peg. And so after he gave a talk one night, he's going from Gold Hill back to Virginia City, and he is accosted by 6 masked men who put a gun to his head and steal everything he has. He's totally panicked and very unhappy, obviously. And then he still makes his way back safely to Virginia City to his hotel, and the next morning he is awakened by one of his friends, who was a brother of the guys that lived in Jackass Hill, and said, "Ha ha ha, Marcus, didn't you love our practical joke we played on you last night? Here's all your stuff back." There is a legend that Daly may have been one of the 6 robbers. We can't prove it, but if so, what's interesting is Twain did tour Montana in 1895. He spoke not only in Butte, but he pulled together kind of a last minute gig in Anaconda as well. And one of the things that's nice about those old newspapers is that they are full of news like, Marcus Daly left town today. Marcus Daly came back to town today. And guess where Marcus Daly was when Twain did his talk in Anaconda? He was in Anaconda. So, you know, there was obviously some kind of a connection there. Also, both of them have a connection to Henry Rogers. Henry Rogers was most famous as Standard Oil. I think he was chairman. He also was vice president of Amalgamated Copper when that whole switchover occurred in 1899. And by the way, Amalgamated Copper was not owned by Standard Oil. They just had Rogers and William Rockefeller in common. So it was, you know, technically at arm's length. But Henry Rogers was also very good friends with Twain. Rogers bailed him out. Twain had some serious financial trouble, and Rogers helped him. Now, another connection may have been James Keene, who was also on the Comstock. He bought several of Daly's horses at the dispersal sale in 1901. They produced, those mares that he bought, produced 2 of the most famous horses of the first decade of the 20th century, Sissinby and Colin. And he was a stockbroker who helped manage the stock of Amalgamated, and for more on that, do look at Frenzied Finance. In Utah, Daly was hired by the Walker brothers, and I love these guys. We have Samuel Sharp Walker, Joseph Robinson Walker, David Frederick Walker, and then they ran out of middle names. This is Matt Jr. And they went by their middle names, just so you know. It makes records real confusing, but there you have it. They hired Daly to work at the Emma mine in Alta, Utah, where he was the mine superintendent. He may have been a superintendent back in Hamilton, Nevada, but this is the first time we know for sure he was in charge. As they're working the vein, he said, the Emma's not gonna last, it's gonna play out, and I suggest you sell. They did. And when they sold, it was at the top of the market. It was kind of like cryptocurrency today. Worldwide investors, President of the United States has friends and relatives. Within 2 years, the whole thing's worthless. And a number of people, but not the Walker brothers, lost their shirts. So they moved Daly to Ophir, Utah, lovely area. And he began to run multiple mines in Ophir, plus staked some of his own claims. We have his application for patents in the newspapers there. So I have quite a bit about that in my book. He also met up with a priest, originally from County Tipperary. Is that okay? And Father Lawrence Scanlon started out ministering to the miners in the camps. Daly connected with him and said, we have a lot of injuries in these mines. We need major medical care. They worked together to bring the Sisters of the Holy Cross to Salt Lake City, founding a hospital that is now part of the Utah Regional Medical Center. Scanlon goes on to become the first Catholic bishop of Salt Lake City, and of course I have to say first Catholic bishop because the Latter-day Saints also have a very powerful influence, and their leadership are also referred to as bishops. There were many bishops in Salt Lake City prior to Father Scanlon, just not of the Catholic faith. Also in Ophir, Utah, Daly meets a fine young woman named Margaret Price Evans, and this is their family. This man is Zenas Evans, her father. Somebody asked me if these Evanses were related to Morgan Evans in Anaconda. I have not researched that question. I don't think so. Morgan Evans was born, I think, in Wales. Zenas Evans, as far as I know, was born in Ohio, but anybody can set me straight, and we can clarify that, probably will in the next book, because I'll be talking about Morgan Evans. She married Daly in 1872. They married in Rob Walker's mansion in the living room, partly because she was a Protestant, he was a Catholic. And according to local history in County Cavan, Marcus's mother was very unhappy about this and apparently started sending back his remittances, at least for a while. And their first two children, Margaret Augusta Daly, the Evanses, they also like to recycle names, so there were lots of Margarets. She was born in Ophir, as was Molly Gerard, Mary Daly, nicknamed Molly Gerard. Another very good friend of Daly's was Robert Chambers, here in Butte, Chambers Block. They were partners in the bank that later became the Metals Bank. He was the mining superintendent for George Hearst at the Ontario mine, which was the one where we know Daly connected with Hearst and told him about this little hole in the ground that looked promising. The Walkers had looked at it, they didn't want it, so Daly tells George Hearst. George Hearst buys it, and it is the leading silver mine in the United States by 1881. And maybe the first chink in the armor of the relationship between Daly and the Walkers, because they blew him off and Hearst cashed in. Daly comes to Montana in 1876, and we have this little map kind of shows you the Montana Trail, which later became the railroad, which later became I-15. He came this direction. There's some stuff about how he left for Idaho. Some people thought he was going this direction to Coeur d'Alene. Nope, you're following I-90 here, folks. He came from the south. A freight trail, I use this Charlie Russell to show you how we got to Montana before there were railroads. And if you didn't ride your horse or take a stagecoach, which was often a target for robbery, you were hauling freight. And you'll notice we have, if you take a detailed look at this painting by, there's something like 20 oxen, and there's 1, 2, 3 wagons hitched together. This particular painting is of Fort Benton, and you can see another wagon train back there, but these things just trudged along for 400 miles, hauling mostly silver ore from Butte down to the Transcontinental Railhead in Utah. And ladies and gentlemen, this is Butte when Daly arrived. Which direction are we looking there, Kim? I looked it over once. Is that, I can't remember which way we're looking.
I don't remember.
But it obviously was not the thriving metropolis it later became. A couple of myths: Daly did not sneak into town in disguise. There had already been rumors that one of the Walker brothers was going to come up to Butte. The only subterfuge was that the Walkers didn't come up here, they sent Daly, so maybe there was a little sneakiness going on. But he scouted a number of properties, and they ultimately bought the Alice, as well as several other mines in September 1876. One of the first people Daly met was our good friend and his future nemesis, Clark, and I just love this quote about it. A will as resolute as adamant. And adamant was a substance in those days. I mean, just hard steel. You're not going to mess with Mr. Clark. There's a lot of rumors about how the Clark-Daly feud began. Most of them wrong. Some of them easily debunked. But it's possible that they just simply hated each other on sight. Who could be more different than Daly and Clark? An interesting thing, of course, is that yes, he did have a bank, but the story about the bank draft probably was not true because, for one thing, Clark and Ed Larrabee, Samuel Edward Larrabee of Deer Lodge, they happened to own a third of the Alice. Roland Butcher had 2/3. And so when the Walkers bought the Alice, they were buying it from, in part, Clark and Larrabee. And I talk about that a lot more in my book as well. He also owned the Dexter Stamp Mill, and that's an interesting side story. He also owned the Moulton, which was next to the Alice. So he had his thumb on the pulse of what the Walkers were doing in the Alice, and he was kind of going the same direction they were. There's some other stories about how the Clark-Daly feud began. Each of them are probably part of the truth. In Butte, Daly's very active socially. He brings up his wife and kids. The community around the Alice is not called Butchertown. That's just a neighborhood. What do we call the whole town today? Walkerville. One of the things that Daly was somewhat peripherally involved with was after the Battle of the Big Hole. Remember Father Scanlon and the Holy Cross Hospital. After the Big Hole battle, he helped raise money for medical supplies, not for the Nez Perce that were left just dying on the ground, no, for the soldiers. But they also brought up some wagons down to the Big Hole Valley, brought up wounded soldiers to the hospital at Deer Lodge. This may have been a relief party that Daly was a part of when he first kind of realized there's a lot of timber in western Montana. He later may have, the Big Hole Valley is not in the Bitterroot, but it's pretty close. So that may have been there. He also had probably one of the biggest management mistakes of his life in 1878 when he teamed up with A.J. Davis at the Lex, and they said, oh yeah, let's cut the wages of the miners. That did not go over well. And they went on strike. We had the formation of the Butte Working Men's Union on June 13th, 1878. And so Daly learned a very hard lesson about how you treat your workers. And I don't think he ever forgot that one. In the meantime, we have Bill Owsley, county road supervisor, owns a livery stable. That means in those days he had workhorses, and he had the scrapers, and he had the plows, and he had the horse-drawn equipment. He helped build the road from Butte to Helena, which now is more or less our I-15 north. I can't imagine a guy building any kind of road with horse-drawn equipment, but he did. He also took his equipment and laid out a racetrack, which probably was the one over in the racetrack neighborhood that we talk about today. They create a West Side Racing Association committee led by Henry Valentin, who is the partner in the livery stable. They start running race meets. Daly joins them in 1879 because they need somebody to raise purse money. Plus, they had to build a grandstand and a restaurant and a bar and a few other things. Another member becomes a fellow who also partnered with Owsley and Valentin in the livery stable. His name was Lee Mantle. He winds up running the whole West Side Racing Association by 1881. And so these guys are all some of the most politically powerful people in Butte. And I think it's very interesting to see that correlation. Because what people did, how many people have gone to horse races? Okay, so you know there's about half hour between races. The horses run the race and then the next ones come over. In those times, sure, you're looking at the horses and deciding who you want to bet on. But if you own the horses, you already know who you're betting on. So you're in the owner's box and you're consuming food and beverage and you're discussing business and politics and you're networking. It's just like people going golfing today. This was where the power brokers hung out. When Daly bought the Anaconda in 1880, I traced these purchases. It's really interesting to compare the property records at the courthouse to accounts that Daly and Michael Hickey and some of these other folks did in 1895. They don't always match up. But officially, and that's my 5-minute warning, officially, excuse me, okay. He purchases the Anaconda in July 1880. He also resigns from the Alice. He makes 3 different trips to California, and in June 1881 announces that he sold the Anaconda to our friends Hearst, Hagen, and Tevis. They're first developing it as a silver pump property. But in the meantime, Charles Meterville, is working copper almost exclusively. There's a history of copper in Butte dating back to 1868 when they tried to ship some partially processed copper ingots to Wales because that was the only place in the world that could render it into pure copper. There were other attempts later, and it was a matter of the technology getting to the point where you could actually make it a profitable product. Some people say Charles Meter was the true father of copper mining in the whole West. He built the first copper smelter in the West down in California, Copperopolis in Calaveras County in 1865. He gets to Butte the same year Daly does in 1876. He fires up the first heap roasting stacks to roast copper ore here in Butte. And Daly was watching and trying to figure out what can we do with copper. When they get down in the Anaconda to about 300 feet, they find this stuff. And charcoalsite, is that the proper pronunciation? How do I say that? The mineral. Chalcocite, thank you. So chalcocite, and this is a genuine chunk from the Anaconda mine. And chalcocite, thin layer of native silver, Anaconda mine, Montana, 1883. They found this stuff. They also found it in the St. Lawrence. We have January 1882, a little news piece that they found copper at the St. Lawrence. Daly is in Utah in 1882. By this time, of course, he's no longer working for the Walkers, and in fact, he's getting a little snarky, and he is boasting to the press that Butte was never half as full of promise as at present. Again, he had offered the Anaconda to the Walkers. They turned him down. And he used to say, well, you know, he sold out his interests in the Alice and said when I got to Salt Lake, I'd make him respect my bank account anyhow. So there's a little bit of snark. By June 1882, the Butte Miner says Butte's a copper camp, and off we go. Daly's first empire, of course, is the Anaconda Copper Company. I talk about what happens in June of 1882. This is when he convinces the syndicate to invest in a smelter, and really, Hearst wasn't for it. Tevis thought he was a fool. Hagen takes out his checkbook and says, here you go, draw and keep drawing. And so this is why Hagen gets a mountain named after him, because he backed Daly on the Anaconda. And this is an 1887 image of Anaconda, Montana. Old works in the background over here. And that's how it begins and where my book ends. Daly built another empire. Whenever you are a horse person, there's a joke. How do you make a small fortune with horses? Anybody know the answer? Start with a large fortune. And so as soon as he got money, he starts buying thoroughbreds. And again, this little guy right here is Tammany. This slide, this was a painting by Henry Cross in 1892. You can see the lumber mill over here. You can see the half-mile oval covered racetrack right there. It's kind of a donut-shaped thing. Half mile under a roof for conditioning racehorses in the winter. The Bitteret stock farm was 22,000 acres. He had 1,200 horses at least. And that was really his heart's desire. He's coming back, in a way, to Valley Jamestown. He's going to the lush, much moister. He starts an irrigation project. He builds apple orchards. He's running horses. He's running cattle. He's logging timber off the Bitterets off of the public domain without paying for it. That doesn't come around until after he dies, that he gets us in trouble for that. Another connection to the Clark-Daly feud in the election of 1888. Many, many threads come together. But his horses, this is the carriage house still standing. This was his racehorse Montana. By the way, this painting is in a gallery in New York City for about $25,000. It could be yours. They're anxious to sell. And he also founds the community of Hamilton, Montana. By the way, anybody recall last year there was a series done in Butte about ghosts?
Which one? There were two.
Episode 6 of Ghosts of Devil's Perch mentions a guy named Sam Lucas. I might have talked to them about that a little bit, and then they took what I told them and screwed it up and did it all wrong, but that's okay. We didn't expect, this is entertainment. But this is Sam Lucas. He was Daly's stud farm manager. This was when he was at the top of the world building the stallion barn called Tammany's Castle, still standing today. It's a private home. Again, here's our little friend Tammany and one of his buddies, Hamburg. The horse racing operation was enormous. Lucas made $10,000 a year in $1890. Later, unfortunately, took to drink, went back to Kentucky to try to save his marriage. His wife left him, divorced him, took their 4 kids, they had 3 of them here, took their 4 kids with her. He found his way back to Montana by about 1905, and by 1908 we find him in Butte, Montana, working in the mines. Never went back to raising horses by then. He said there was never a place in horsedom like the Daly Bitteret farm. Proceeded to slowly drink himself to death. When the Montana legislature abolished gambling in 1915, he pops up in the city directory for 1916 as the watchman at the racetrack. He's presiding over the corpse as it's sold off and developed. By 1917, he's committed to the Poor Farm Hospital here, probably to dry out. They kick him out shortly after as an influenza epidemic brings more people to that hospital than they can handle. And a shout out to the archives. The Poor Farm records were here, and that's where I found all of that information. He ultimately gets busted a couple years later for selling really bad moonshine that makes people a little crazy. By the mid-20s, he's back in the Poor Farm again, now having dementia, probably alcohol-related, and dies in 1929, right here in Butte. He is buried in Butte. Again, I want to do a shout out to David and his wife Pat because they were helpful. We found his gravesite, and the reason that Sam Lucas is now in Find a Grave, and he has no headstone. So that's a wrong that I think should be corrected. But his gravesite is it's not at the Poor Farm Cemetery, it's out at is it Holy Cross Cemetery out there on the Platts. And we have a picture of that site, so we have something tracked there. And with that, I am finished, only 5 minutes late. And this is Marcus Daly in the current location, and I think it's very fitting that he's overlooking Butte. And he's got Our Lady of the Rockies over there keeping an eye on him. So thank you so much.